All right, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are sitting down with a repeat guest and a friend of the show, Dr. David Brakke, to talk about the forbidden and heretical book, cue the ominous music, the Gospel of Judas. So David, welcome back to the show. It's always an honor to talk to you.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So for our listeners, if you want to know more about David, head back to the episodes. It was like a year ago, maybe summer of 2021. And listen to the conversation we had about the Gnostics. But today that we have a lot to talk about concerning this book, the Gospel of Judas. Now, I told you, David, before we hit record that I picked up your book that you just wrote on the Gospel of Judas. And for our listeners, it's part of the Anchor Yale Bible. Is that correct? Anchor Yale Bible
Correct.
series?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'll be honest, I'm not a scholar. And so the first section was a little over my head, which you warned me about when we were emailing about the translation stuff and Coptic and all that. But the second section with the commentary and the notes, there was so much in there that I found so interesting. So maybe we could start off with the general stuff. Like, tell us a little bit about what we know of this gospel. Like, when was it written? Do we have any idea who wrote it? And if not, like from what tribe or group they were from? I know it spent time in a safety deposit box. I heard something like that. So maybe give us like a high level overview of what do we know about this book?
Well, we've always known, that is the scholarly community, have always known that there was a Gospel of Judas because multiple early Christian authors mention it. The earliest being Irenaeus.
I'm sure he liked it a lot, right? He had a lot of good
things. He did not like it, but he mentions it around the year 180. In his massive book against Gnostics and Valentinians and other heretical, quote unquote, groups. Yep. And so he knows this Gospel of Judas and he associates it with a group he calls the Gnostics or the Gnostic school of thought. So he mentions it, and so it had always been known that there was a Gospel of Judas, and it was just assumed to be lost. And there had been some theories that, although Irenaeus made it clear that the Judas here was Judas Iscariot, there were some theories that maybe Irenaeus had misunderstood, and that the Judas here is like Judas Thomas, or the Judas who allegedly wrote the Epistle of Jude, which really should be the Epistle of Judas, right? Which is one reason we always say Judas. But so in any event, we always knew that there was this Gospel of Judas. But scholars did not become aware that it really existed, and have a copy of it until 2006, but it goes back earlier, obviously. So it seems, we don't know the details, that in the late 1970s, a Coptic codex was discovered in Egypt, in the region of Almenia. We can't be certain about all these details. And some Western scholars got their first look at it in 1983 in a kind of strange scene in a hotel room in Geneva and stuff like this. But anyway,
sounds like a movie.
It is. There should be a movie. Well, there was a National Geographic special when it came out that had movie-like elements because people acted out some of this stuff. But the gist is that various middlemen and antiquities dealers tried to get the best deal for the codex in terms of money for basically the 1980s, 1990s. So for 20 years. And it went through, people did things like rearrange the pages, put it in a safe deposit box where it just stayed for a long time. One antiquities dealer thought it was a good idea to, freeze it, which of course was not a good idea because it's papyrus, so it's organic material. So, so the liquid that was in there, froze, and then when it was thawed, became liquid. So anyway, it was very ill-treated, but the gist is that it is in Coptic. And the first question is, of course, is this the Gospel of Judas that Irenaeus mentions in 180, which must have been in Greek, because that was, the language of Christians at the time. And most scholars have decided yes, that this is so. There are dissents, and if you want to hear about that, we can talk about it. But the gist is that if that's the case, then it must have been written in Greek sometime before by the 170s it had been written. Then the question is, how early is it? And I don't think it can be much earlier than the 130s, I think. So it's probably the middle of the 2nd century, written in Greek. When the Coptic translation was made is not certain, but we can date the Coptic Codex very confidently to the 4th century, to the 300s, because there's been radiocarbon dating, which gives a kind of wide range, but comparison of the script with other known manuscripts from that time, like the Nag Hammadi codices, very famous, makes it pretty certain that it's from the 4th century. So that's it. We have no idea who wrote it. There is no authorial claim. It's not, very interesting, not the Gospel according to Judas, as the Gospel according to Matthew, which suggests authorship, right? It's the Gospel about Judas, and the author does not identify himself. We'll just assume him. And so we don't. Now, but I tend to believe, Irenaeus, that the author was a Gnostic, that is, belonged to this group of Christians who called themselves Gnostics and had certain very distinct beliefs from other Christians. Then there's a question of where it was written. So this is the last little bit to talk about. And the gist is that because it was written in Greek in the 2nd century by a Christian, it could come from anywhere in the Mediterranean world, because Christians, even in the areas of the Roman Empire that we think of as Latin speaking, were using Greek at this time. But I have proposed as a possible location, and I'm not the only one, Rome, because some of the practices and beliefs against which the author polemicizes, the things he doesn't like, we find in Christian texts and sources that are connected with Rome in the 2nd century. But this is completely hypothetical, could not be proved, and
So there's a lot of like cross-referencing that goes on when you're trying to figure out where these ideas maybe have originated, or who wrote it, or where it was from. Like you can look at other texts that were around at that time and see the parallels between them.
Right. So perhaps the other most famous Gnostic text is the Apocryphon of John, or secret book according to John, right? And a lot of scholars think, well, this probably comes from Alexandria, because it has a lot of resonances with Philo, the great Jewish scholar who was active in Alexandria in the 1st century, and other kinds of stuff that you see percolating in Alexandria. Again, no way to prove this, but that's the kind of argument that one makes. The Gospel of Judas, however, has none of those kinds of philosophical connections. So
what I find
think about other things.
What I find so interesting is, like you said, it was your date proposal for date is like the 130s, you said, right?
Or to the 170s.
To the 170s.
Somewhere in there,
somewhere
right?
In that
no
ballpark.
Earlier than the 130s, I don't think, because it seems to know the other Gospels.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting, because one of the things I was always told regarding these books is that, well, they were written so long after all the other books, they couldn't possibly have any basis in early Christianity. But if it is 130s, 140s, 150s, whatever, that's not long after like the Gospel of John was written. Like if you think about the grand scheme of things, we're talking about the same kind of window of history. So that must mean these ideas, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the ideas portrayed in this book were floating around at that time.
Definitely.
Right.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean, one reason I don't think it can be earlier than the 130s is that I think the author does know one or more of the canonical Gospels, as we call them, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and probably Matthew at least. And so that means those texts must have had time to circulate and become known to other people. But it also represents the case that obviously this author didn't think they had written the last word at this, and he had his own thing.
There's more to be said.
Right. And he doesn't explicitly mention these texts. He just seems to assume that you might have read them or know about them.
Gotcha. All right, so let's get into some of the good stuff. Maybe tell us about what is this book about? Like, what's the main story, the main narrative? And it's funny because the other night I was telling my wife that you were coming on the show, and I said that we're talking about the Gospel of Judas. This was over dinner, and she's like, "Oh, cool! Like I've heard about that. Like, what's it say?" So I go into this like 10-minute monologue about the story after reading your book and the King and Pagel's book and a little bit of Bart Ehrman's book. And by the way she was looking at me, I was making no sense. so take us into the story a little bit in a way that's going to make a whole lot more sense than anything I could explain. What's going on in the Gospel of Judas?
Well, the Gospel of Judas opens by announcing what it is, which it calls itself a secret report of judgment in which Jesus and Judas will discuss things. So it identifies itself as a judgment text right at the start, right? Then it gives a little summary of Jesus's ministry. He came to earth to save people, performed miracles, called disciples, and so forth. And then it kind of shifts into which is all very familiar. Christian readers would be like,
nothing's too crazy yet. Yep.
No. And then suddenly it kind of shifts into a different mode, into a kind of weird, different time-space thing in which Jesus has a series of conversations with all the disciples and then with just Judas himself alone. And the conversations kind of unfold over a certain, and I'll come back to the content of those in a second. And then at the end of these conversations, Jesus goes up in a cloud. But then the next thing we know, we're kind of back in the story world of the New Testament Gospels with Jesus in the upper room on the night in which he is betrayed. And Judas is outside that room discussing Jesus with Jewish scribes, and he agrees to take money from them and hand Jesus over to them, and then it ends. So it's an odd kind of, it identifies itself as taking place in an 8-day period right up to the day before Jesus's death. So this would be right up to that night, right? And so that's when it ends. So the conversations are mostly with Jesus and Judas, and what they reveal primarily is why Judas needs to do what he has to do, which is hand Jesus over, and why people have misunderstood the meaning and significance of Jesus's death, and why their practice of the Eucharist to commemorate that death is wrongly practiced. And so the content of these conversations show how other Christians have gone wrong, and explain, if you want to put it this way, the real reason Judas had to do what he had to do. And yeah, so there it is. That's the framework of it. And a lot of the content is highly negative about other Christians and about the divine, semi-divine, whatever you want to call them, beings that actually rule this cosmos as we know it.
Wow. Okay, so now I have a whole list of questions. So where am I going to start? Okay, so let me think. The book ends, right? We said that the book ends very abruptly, right? And I was surprised when I first read that, because it just ends with, I think, Judas just handing over Jesus, or saying that, or agreeing to hand over Jesus, something like that, right?
Yes.
And so there's no rest, there's no crucifixion, there's obviously no resurrection, all that stuff is gone. Is there something in what the author left out that the author is trying to say to us? Because obviously there's a lot that you can say by the things you include, but it feels so obvious that there should be something more there, right? Because we're so familiar with these other gospels. Like, obviously, Judas hands over Jesus. The next thing is the big thing is the crucifixion and the resurrection. These are the magnificent stones of Christianity that we all know about, but they're not there in this text. So is there something there that you think that the author is trying to tell us by what he's leaving out?
Well, I think what the leaving out of that stuff indicates is that he thinks people already know what happened next.
Okay.
So I think he assumes that from the other gospels. So he's not saying the other gospels are completely wrong, right?
Okay, yeah.
He assumes that that indeed, thanks to Judas, Jesus was arrested, the crucifixion occurred, and then the question becomes, then we have to kind of speculate. Did he believe in a resurrection? We can talk about, because this is
that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you believe in it?
Well, we can just dive right into this. The problem is, Jesus talks about the salvation of humans quite a bit in this. And it's clear that what humans need to be saved from is indeed their mortality. That is what has led to our unhappiness in this world, is the fact that we were made by these rebellious lower divinities who constrain us through our mortality. They limit our lifespan, and time controls us, right? Our time is ticking away, if you want to put it that way. So then, when Jesus talks, and it's always very elusively and briefly about salvation, he seems to assume that human beings, all of us, have kind of three components to us: a body, which will die, a soul, which is the center of your personality. It's what makes you you, right? And then a spirit, which is given to you by God, which is what makes you alive. And it's clear he describes death as when the spirit leaves the body. And he seems to assume that people who are not saved, when that happens, both their souls and their bodies die. The people who are saved, their bodies die, but their soul goes up to the higher realm of true divinity. There is no mention at any time of a resurrection for us, for normal humans, of our bodies in the future, or any kind of notion of resurrection. It seems to believe the soul of the saved people, when your body dies and this divine spirit has gone away, so that your soul goes up, and that's it. There's no resurrection. So the question becomes, did he think, for example, that the Jesus, what happened to Jesus? And this is obscure, because the author, when Jesus talks about the crucifixion, he says the person who dies and suffers is, Jesus says, the human being who bears me. So the divine Jesus is clearly separate from the human Jesus, in some sort of, in terms of, nature or something of that kind. So did the author believe that, and Jesus is quite clear that the crucifixion will not harm him. That is the divine Jesus who speaks in this text. It will only kill the human being who bears Jesus. So then the question becomes, did the author believe that the human being who bare Jesus was resurrected? We do not know.
We can only guess.
Yes, we can only guess. And, I think it's possible he does. Irenaeus says that there are Gnostics who have a very similar view, that they're divine being who's in a human being, and only the human being dies on the cross, but who also believe that that human being was raised up as a kind of sign that the presence in Jesus was divine. It indicates this was more than just an ordinary human being. So it's possible this guy believes this. We don't know it, but it doesn't seem as though he considers a resurrection for us as part of our future.
Okay. So you talked about how, for the writer, the people who are saved, right, their souls and their spirits, I believe you said, continue to live, but the body and the spirit, or the body and the soul of the person who's not saved, it just goes away. So what is salvation then for this writer? Because you mentioned earlier that they're kind of pushing up against kind of maybe what's going to become that orthodox belief of Jesus's death for I guess a sacrifice for the sins of all people, whatever. So if there's still the talk of salvation here, and there's people who gain salvation and their souls continue to live, what does salvation look like for this writer in your estimation?
Well, I think these people, the question is, how do you so the salvation consists in your soul continuing to exist after your death. That's what you want to have happen. How do you get to have that happen? There seem to be two things that Jesus does that makes this possible. One is, of course, reveal to you all this information, namely that the God who created us and who is the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jewish people, the God who most Christians worship as the Father of Jesus, that is not the true God. There is a higher God called the invisible spirit. And so God gives this, makes available, apparently made available to people from the get-go, because it says it was given to Adam and the people around him. The gnosis, the word is used, gives people the gnosis, the knowledge of this. So the first thing to be saved is you need to have this knowledge. You need to know and recognize and stop, therefore, worshiping the God of the Old Testament, the God who created humans.
The lower God.
Right? The lower God, exactly. So you need to have that information and stop doing that. Okay, so that's one thing that has to happen. And then the second thing that has to happen is these lower gods need to be like destroyed and gotten rid of. And that seems to be what the death of Jesus accomplishes. That is, the death of Jesus is called a sacrifice, but this author doesn't think sacrifice is such a great thing because it's what this lower God demands, right? He demands sacrifice. But when Jesus, the human being who bears Jesus, is sacrificed, and he calls it a sacrifice, he says to Judas, you will sacrifice the human being who bears me. This seems to be kind of like the gift that destroys the recipient or something like this. That is, the sacrifice is made to the lower God of the human being who bears Jesus, but this sacrifice results eventually in his destruction and the overthrow of him and all his rulers, right? Now, this, I should point out, is a common theme already in the New Testament, right? The idea that Jesus's death and resurrection are a kind of victory over sin and death that destroys them is something you find in Paul, for example. I mean, you find that idea much more in Paul than the idea of atonement, right? The idea that Jesus is sacrificed for sin. You find that very briefly in Romans chapter 3, but otherwise it's Jesus's death and resurrection are victory over death. And that seems to be, and the defeat of the ruler of this world, which Paul calls, I assume, Satan, right? So anyway, so that's how it seems to work. You need to know this information, which gnosis, and you need Jesus to come and be sacrificed, and in that way overcome these rulers that lord it over us.
Sure. So then the looking at the story then of Judas, we're all familiar with the idea that Judas betrayed Jesus for these 30 pieces of silver, and some say it's because he wanted the money, some say it's because he was bored of Jesus and was this wasn't what the Messiah is supposed to do, whatever the case may be. But the story of Judas, the Gospel of Judas, takes a little bit of a different twist, obviously, because it's almost like Jesus and Judas, and correct me if I'm wrong, but having this like backroom conversation saying this is the way it needs to go down. And so Judas hands over Jesus. Now I'm assuming because of what you just spoke of, that because that death had to happen in order to overthrow this lower God. And so it's kind of like this behind the scenes plan of, you're the end guy because you understand who I am. So you're going to be my man, and you're going to be the one who's going to help me make this happen.
Yes, Judas has this role because there's an early scene, one of the first conversations of Jesus with the disciples. Judas is, among the disciples of Jesus, the only one who knows that Jesus is not the son of the Old Testament God, but in fact comes from this higher realm, this higher divinity, the invisible spirit, and specifically a aspect of the higher God called the Barbelo, which is a distinctive Gnostic character. And because Judas knows these things, Jesus says, well, I got more to tell you, and kind of takes him apart and
but wait, there's more, right?
Yes, and gives him all this information, which I think is to explain, this is why you're going to need to do this. And because you're the one who understands what this is all about. And this is, and it's interesting, at the end of the gospel, it says, they come to Judas, the scribes do, and Judas does what they wished. So you kind of get a sense that Judas himself isn't necessarily excited to be doing this, and indeed he shouldn't be, because Jesus keeps telling him things are not going to be good for you, despite the fact that you have to do this, right? So so Judas's role is essential, but having someone killed is still a bad thing. And but Judas has this information which the other disciples do not. He sees what needs to be done, and he has the knowledge of who Jesus really is, that the other disciples do not have. And by the way, this is precisely what Irenaeus, when he mentioned the gospel in the year 180, pointed out as one of its features, that Judas knows what the other disciples do not.
And that almost elevates him above those disciples, right? Because doesn't Jesus call him like says he's gonna be like the 13th, or he mentions like he's the 13 or something like that, like he's gonna be, and is that almost like he's gonna be a step above these other disciples, like he's going to be a super disciple?
Yes, exactly. So it's cryptic, but the gospel seems to be saying that, well, once these current rulers are overthrown, who's going to run things here? Looks like it's going to be Judas, actually, that he himself is going to become what he calls the 13th demon, and which is indeed kind of above the 12. And it looks like he will kind of become the I don't know how you'd put it, the manager or administrator of this lower cosmos after these other rulers are removed. It's not perhaps a particularly compelling assignment, not maybe the most attractive thing. And Jesus says, you're not going to go up to what we would call heaven. You're not going to go up there. You're going to stay here and have a continuing job to do. And people are going to hate you and curse you and all that kind of stuff. So
which
no,
they have.
Exactly so. And obviously the author, writing in the mid 100s, we assume already is already, this explains, yes, people do hate Judas and they curse him, but it was part of his task to do this.
Now in the gospel, Jesus laughs a lot, right? Which I think is so funny. And I was talking to my wife, like I said before, about this over dinner. My daughter was there, she's 5, and I was saying that Jesus would laugh at the disciples, and my daughter says, why isn't Jesus being nice at the disciples? But
good question.
Right? So according to what I've read in your book, along with the others, is that whenever Jesus laughs, it's like the reader needs to pay attention, right? Because he's about to flip some idea on his head or teach us something new or different. So you don't have to go through all of them unless you want to, that's fine. But which one do you think is maybe the most significant or the most important for like a modern reader to know, which idea that Jesus is kind of flipping on its head?
Oh, by far the first time Jesus laughs. Jesus, this is, the opening of this kind of main section of the gospel with all these conversations. Jesus comes across the disciples having a meal, which the disciples call their Eucharist, their Thanksgiving, right? Eucharist in Greek just means Thanksgiving. So they're portrayed as making Eucharist over the bread, and then they refer to their Eucharist. And when Jesus sees this, he laughs. And the disciples think he's laughing at them. They say, why are you laughing at us? This is what we're supposed to do. And he says, well, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing because by this ritual, your God is blessed or praised or whatever. And so what he's laughing at is the ritual and the idea of this God being blessed and praised in this ritual. And it is indeed a kind of mocking, derisive laughter, I would say. The idea of God laughing at his enemies is found in the Psalm 2, where God laughs them to scorn. If you ever listen to the Messiah by Handel, that's one of the earliest little songs that the I think the bass sings. But in any event, Jesus, that's really to laugh at the central ritual that most Christians perform, the Eucharist, is pretty intense. And that's the moment where, and the disciples in response say, what do you mean our God? You're the son of our God. And that's when Jesus is like, oh, you don't know. You don't know.
We have so much to talk about.
Yes, exactly. And that's when he kind of gives this challenge, and Judas is the one who steps up and says, I know you actually come from the Barbelo, right? And so the gist is that this is the moment, if you're a Christian who's not a part of the group of this guy, the author of this thing, that you go, oh my goodness, because he's saying the ritual you do is misguided, and it's offered to a God who is not, in fact, the father of Jesus, and this is wrong. And you've done this because you think this is what Jesus's death should lead to. That is, this meal, this Jesus's body and blood, but no, the whole thing is wrong. You've misunderstood. The God you worship is not the real God, and so forth.
I'm thinking
nothing that follows is at all as shocking as that. I mean, it's all, the rest of it is all kind of filling out that kind of central insight.
The major shock factors there in the beginning, right?
Yes, from that point on, people should be, people who are not part of the author's group, right? And so for whom these ideas are new and different would have been shocked by this. And indeed, the whole tenor of the gospel is stop doing this.
So I was going to ask, what would the writer of Judas, what would Jesus in this book be telling us to do with communion, right? If that's what most people call it. It was just scrap it all together. It's meaningless. You're performing this for the lower God. You're not performing this for me, who came from the higher God.
Again, this is where we kind of run into the problem that this is a completely negative text in the sense that it is mostly why other people are wrong, right? So does this mean that this author's group had no common meal that they shared as a common experience? Possibly they didn't. On the other hand, possibly they did. They just didn't celebrate it as a sacrifice to the God of Israel and a commemoration of Jesus's death, in which the bread and wine are his body and blood. I mean, they may have just, because Christians, of course, also had, non-Gnostic Christians also had this thing called the agape meal, right, where they all got together and shared a meal, and especially people who didn't eat well all the time were able to do so. And for a while, you would do the agape meal and the Eucharist at the same event. That seems to be happening when Paul's writing. He says, you're getting together for dinner and then you're doing this Eucharist thing. But at some point, these become separate rituals. And Christians, we know, did continue to celebrate an agape meal that was not the Eucharist. And the Eucharist became more a symbolic eating, right? You just eat bread and wine. You don't have a whole, meal.
Whole meal,
so it's possible they did that. But this is one of the things people might say, oh, they have no meal at all because they're against Eucharist. But this is the problem. This is a text that's criticizing other people, but we don't really know what his positive message would be. I mean, it's definitely stop doing the Eucharist, but whether that means we don't have another.
Right. We only have one side of the coin. We have the negative side of the
exactly.
coin.
We only have the negative side. And, so that's what the author tells us at the beginning. He says, this is a judgment, a report of judgment. So, this is, I often, because people will read this and think, oh, this is such a depressing text. And the author clearly has no positive message of salvation. This is just, awful, because, most of it is negative. And I say, well, we don't have that positive message text, right? This would be like, most kids, unfortunately today, if they know anything about like Jonathan Edwards, the great Christian theologian, greatest one this country ever produced. It's from sinners in the hands of an angry God, a horrible, fire and brimstone sermon. But he wrote a lot of other really nice things.
Right.
So, where he's very positive about Jesus and love and nature and how wonderful it is. And so we just don't know what else this guy might have said. That
sure. Now, do you think he would be also coming against like the idea of celebrating like martyrdom? Because I think that like if he's coming against this idea that God demands bloodshed and sacrifice, things like that, there's also, like, I remember from reading like in seminary and stuff, like a lot of the like church fathers are very almost like celebratory about martyrdom, like it's the the highest calling that one could have, to lose your life for your faith and to sacrifice yourself and things like that. Like, is there a sense where this writer is also coming against that as well? Because I'm assuming that kind of language, correct me if I'm wrong, was around in the day that this was perhaps written.
Yes, and this actually is one of the big scholarly controversies actually about the Gospel of Judas, because after this initial scene where Jesus finds the disciples having a meal that they call their Eucharist, and he laughs at it and so forth and so on. Later, the disciples have what we can only call a nightmare, where they oddly, they all have this nightmare in which they are priests sacrificing animals, right? And and it's just, they're sacrificing so many animals that this altar is just like in flames, and it's just amazing. And Jesus says, this is what's happening. You guys are these priests, and the animals you're sacrificing are actually your followers, and you're leading them to their doom and all this stuff. So what is this horrible sacrificial thing, right? And some have argued that the primary reference of that scene is indeed martyrdom. For a variety of reasons, I don't think it's the primary reference of the scene. I think the Eucharist is in fact the primary reference of the scene. But yes, ancient Christians at this time also spoke of martyrs as sacrificial victims, and used the imagery of the Eucharist in association with them. Ignatius of Antioch is the most famous source for this kind of thing. So to the extent that other Christians valued martyrdom as a sacrifice that imitates Jesus's death and is a pleasing sacrifice to the God of Israel, which is what other Christians tended to think, he would clearly be against it, because he doesn't like the God of Israel. He doesn't like sacrifice. He doesn't like any of this stuff. Right. Now, whether this means this author, for example, it believes that, let's say you are arrested for being a Christian, which he thinks of himself as, he thinks he's a Christian, right? He doesn't use that word, but this is what he thinks of himself. And let's say he was arrested for this. Would he say, oh, you should just lie and deny Christ and not suffer martyrdom? That I don't know, and I'm not willing to go down that route and say that he, for example, says you should not be martyred if that comes to you. That is, you should, give up your faith if you're arrested. I'm not sure he would believe that, but I certainly agree that if you say, oh, martyrdom's great because it's a sacrifice in imitation of Jesus's death to the God of Israel, he would say, no. That is, no, that's all wrong, right? Yeah, so part of the issue right now in early Christian studies is how much of a big deal martyrdom was in this period. And but it certainly existed, and it whether this author, what his attitude was, if you're arrested, what should you do? I have no idea.
Yeah, I just had John Dominic Crossan just came on the show not that long ago, and he was talking about his new book, Render Unto Caesar, and we're talking about Revelation, and he talks about how, in his estimation, the writer of Revelation is really kind of blowing up the story, so to speak, and making martyrdom out to be perhaps a bigger thing than it might have actually been in that day. And we've all been led to believe, and I have, as from certainly in school and everything like that, that Christians were just being murdered left and right and crucified left and right, all the time. And he says that possibly might not be the case.
No, I mean, the important thing to say is that martyrdom was real and people did die. I mean, Justin Martyr was a martyr who lived at this time, and Ignatius of Antioch presumably did get killed and all that kind of stuff. So martyrdom was happening.
It was a thing. Yeah,
it was a thing, right? The thing is it wasn't empire-wide, and it wasn't consistent until the year 250. So before the year 250, it was always local, and your local officials had to care. People could say, oh, we have a Christian down the street, and that's probably why we have bad flooding happening, whatever, because they're offending the gods, and so forth. The local governor or whatever may have been like, oh, please don't bother me with this. The reason we have flooding is we have bad sewage pipes or something. I mean, so, he would have had to care. And it, a lot of them didn't. And so the fact is that, it was not, and texts that are about the problem of everyone hates us are of course going to make this a big deal, right? As Revelation does and stuff, right? So, but certainly martyrdom did occur. It was not constant. Christians didn't necessarily live in constant fear. Everything changes in the year 250 when the Emperor Decius does in fact have an empire-wide policy that everyone must sacrifice to
a bit of a monster.
And then it's bad news for Christians. And in the so-called Great Persecution that happens in the early 300s is equally horrific. So, but no, in the 2nd century, and when the book of Revelation was written, it was a local thing. That doesn't minimize how awful it was for the people who got caught in it. But it's not like it was a constant.
It's a bit more perspective.
That's right. Right.
Okay. So last question for you. A lot of people who are listening to the show are not scholars. So maybe some of them are, most of them aren't. Most of us are, deconstructing out of this evangelical world. We're trying to piece back our faith. We don't want to let it go. We're just trying to piece back ways that make sense to us. So let's get practical with this book. Like the Gospel of Judas, obviously, like you said, has kind of a negative rap, right? It's not like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Thomas, these extra biblical books where people might be like, oh, I can glean something from this to, it's a little bit of an uplifting message. But I feel like even so, I feel like this book can still be useful for people who are leaving evangelicalism. They're really pushing back on that, sense of orthodoxy in today's world. And so I guess my question is like, how can this book help inform someone's faith today who's in that kind of place where they're deconstructing, reconstructing? Because obviously the writer wrote this for a reason. It was important to him to write this thing down. So why, and what might the writer want us to take away today in a more modern age? Again, more
that's
speculation.
A great question,
but
because, I'll be honest, and I say this at the preface of my book, I find really pretty much nothing of spiritual nourishment really in this book. It's very negative, right? And it's mostly polemical. However, the heart of the question of this book is, who is the God that you really worship? And what sacrifice do you make in your worship of that God? And and that's what's upsetting the author, these people. And he feels as though the leaders of these other Christian communities, whom we would call the Orthodox, right, are sacrificing the souls and lives of their followers because they're leading them astray. Okay, now we can say, oh, I don't, that's not what was happening. But this book does say, think hard about the God that you're worshiping and the acts that you do in honor of that God, and who or what you may be sacrificing in that activity. And and I would encourage people who want to think deeply about these things to say, you can say I worship this God, but one's lifestyle, the things one chooses to do, the kinds of activities one engages in, and so forth, may suggest that you actually worship something else. And I think that's kind of the heart, for me at least, what this gospel raises is the question of, what God do you really worship in your life? And what kind of sacrifices are you asking of others, really? in your service to this God.
It's really good. And I guess we see that most evident, like you said, in that beginning piece where the disciples are having the Eucharist and they're saying, no, we're doing this for God. And Jesus,
right,
you're not doing it for God.
No, and this gospel has an acute sense of sin, right? It condemns people for doing bad things, committing murder, adultery, all that kind of stuff, kinds of things. And what it wants to say is, look at your own behavior, what you're doing. This will reveal what your true worship really is. And I think to the extent that it makes us all a little bit self-reflective about our own worship lives and our practical lives and our ethics and what that means, and especially the notion of sacrifice. And people say, we should sacrifice for God, and I'm like, well, what, there's one thing to call upon oneself to make sacrifices for God and for others, but we often unintentionally or deliberately ask other people to sacrifice things, and we should think about what we're doing when we do that.
That's right. Well, that gives us a lot to chew on, my friend.
Yes.
So thank you. But we're just about out of time, but this has been really good and really informative, and I can't thank you enough for taking time to talk to us.
It's totally fun. I'm so glad you asked me back.
Thank you. And real quick, what resources would you recommend for people who want to learn more about this gospel? I mean, I know I mentioned the Pagels and Kings book. I think Ehrman's book, and your book is a little bit more of the scholarly one, but which ones can we throw in there that people can maybe head to Amazon and pick up?
No, so exactly. So those are good books that you mentioned, Pagels and King and Ehrman. The only kind of downside to them is that they were written before what happened in 2010. They started to surface in 2009, is that new fragments of the Gospel of Judas were discovered that those authors did not have access to when they wrote those books. So if you're reading yes, exactly. So anything you read about the Gospel of Judas, if it's written before really 2011, because the fragments were published in 2010, so it took some time for people to become aware of them and use them in there. And then, of course, there's always delays in publication. These people didn't know about those fragments, and sometimes their conclusions and the things they say and the things they worry about have been resolved.
Because these other
like there's a big debate in the early literature about who enters the cloud at the end, Jesus or Judas. And it kind of looked like it could be Judas at the end, but a new fragment showed up. It's Jesus that goes into the cloud. So, so there's a lot of that kind of stuff. So what I would recommend is 2 resources that are post the new fragments that would be helpful. There are 2 ways to contextualize the Gospel of Judas, that is to see how does it fit in the world of early Christianity. One is to read it with other Gospels. And for that, I would recommend a book by Bart Ehrman and Zlatko Plesha called The Other Gospels. Accounts of Jesus from Outside the New Testament, a nice paperback edition. You probably have it. There it is. Yes. And so it has a nice translation of Judas with an introduction, and you can read it next to other early gospels of the time, and you can kind of see how it too is a variation on the basic narrative. And they had the other thing. The other you've also already held up, which is the Gnostic Scriptures.
There it is.
So that's a little self-plug, but it too, it puts it next to other Gnostic texts.
Yes.
So there, although we can't be sure that the author of the Gospel of Judas would agree with, these other Gnostics, they probably didn't agree about everything. You can see in other Gnostic texts, perhaps the more positive messages that you don't see in the Gospel of Judas. And when you put it next to these other texts that are Gnostic, I think a lot of what it's trying to say becomes clearer than it does when you just read it, just on your own by yourself. For example, when Judas says you come from the Barbelo, you're like, Barbelo, what the heck is that? And it's never explained, right? But if you read the Secret Book of John, which comes in this book right before this, exactly what he's saying and what the Barbelo is. So those are the kinds of things I would recommend. And these are both paperbacks that, are accessible easily on Amazon and are meant for non-specialist people. So that's what I would recommend.
Awesome. Well, I'll put the links in the show notes, and I'm sure we'll have you back on to cook up some more heresy.
That would be great.
Awesome.
I'll always love heresy.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.